This is the Paul McGuire Report. On today's program, I want to talk about the power of wisdom and how the power of wisdom enables us to be overcomers and more than conquerors in any situation. Now, it's only the Bible that teaches that truth to the degree that it teaches it in. And it goes back to the time of ancient Solomon. And as you know, Solomon was the wealthiest ruler who ever lived, and he was the most knowledgeable and wisest ruler who ever lived. And the reason that Solomon had such an amazing capacity to gain knowledge makes for an interesting Bible study. In fact, in Volume 2 of A Prophecy of the Future of America, which is entitled A Prophecy of the Future of America, 2016-2017, Volume 2. In Volume 1 and Volume 2, I talk in detail about how during revival, God wants to pour out not only the blessing of His Spirit, but God wants to pour out the blessing of restoration, physical healing, blessing financially, removing the curse and blessing financially. And that's a key thing with God. So the critical thing to understand is that when God came to Solomon and asked Solomon, Solomon, ask me for anything that you want and I'll do it for you. And as I explain in my book, the background, there was background behind this. And Solomon only asked the Lord for two things. He asked the Lord for wisdom, so that, actually he only asked the Lord for one thing, wisdom, so that he could rule his people wisely. That's the only thing that Solomon asked for. Wisdom, so that he could rule his people, God's people, wisely. And God said, because you didn't ask for fame for yourself, or money for yourself, or riches for yourself, or knowledge for yourself, and God said to him, but because you asked for knowledge so that you might rule my people wisely. See, God saw the distinction between what was going on in Solomon's heart and all the other men who had cried out to God, asking God to make them wealthy and famous and knowledgeable and stuff like that. But God withheld it from them because they wanted the wisdom and the fortunes to indulge upon themselves. God could look into the eyes of Solomon and understand, because he's God, omniscient, all-knowing. God understood supernaturally that Solomon was a different breed. This is what Solomon was really going to do when he became king. He was going to rule God's people as wisely as he could, and he would be the wealthiest of all rulers, which in turn would make Israel the wealthiest of all nations. And all this happened in the most mind-blowing sense. I mean, there are history books that record how ancient kings and queens would sail across the earth to have a conference with Solomon. Solomon built an empire. The temple that Solomon built was majestic beyond belief. Solomon built gardens and architecture, and Israel prospered, and the people prospered underneath him. But, as I explain in my book, there's a funny thing that happens to even some of the best intentioned men and women when God begins to bless them, just completely out of their socks. When God really begins to bless them and they become richer than rich and more famous than famous. You know the story. Not all the time, but to a large percentage of the time, when any man or woman gets that level of blessing, it often becomes their undoing. They can't handle it. Not all the time. There are people who, you'd never know what's going on behind the scenes. Let's be honest here. Let's be real here. Just because somebody looks like they have their act together doesn't remotely even mean that they do have their act together. But think for a moment. Most men and women who find themselves the recipients of enormous money, wealth, power, etc., especially when it comes upon them really quick, it can often destroy their personalities. You just look and read the stories of how many super wealthy children, actors and actresses, children, child movie stars, people who had meteoric rises in the international finance world, etc. And so many mysterious suicides, strange deaths, addictions, which cause them to literally consume themselves, often goes with that. Not all the time, but it often goes with that, because the fallen nature inside man or woman can't handle that rapid acceleration of success in a short period of time. I'm going to name the name of a comedian. Many of you will probably don't have any idea who he is. Some of you will know who he is. In any case, I wanted to name the name of this comedian because when I was a kid, or whatever, what I was, I don't remember, a student or whatever, Saturday Night Live began to take off as a TV comedy show. And there were a number of actor comedians who rose up with the show who became like super, super famous. A whole bunch of them became super, super famous. Like Steve Martin would be one. But the Belushi brothers, Jim and John Belushi, and then Jim Belushi was this explosive talent that gripped the world. I mean, kind of schlock comedy style, but people would stand in lines to see his movies and everything else. And he became one of the hottest stars in Hollywood. Also one of the most addicted stars in Hollywood. I think he was addicted to heroin and cocaine or something, or multiple drugs like that, shooting them up and stuff. He'd stay up all night in Manhattan. The hotel that he stayed at when he died was a famous hotel on Sunset Boulevard. So I'm talking about is it Jim or John Belushi? I can't remember their names. Jim Belushi, I think. The funny one. The funnier one. So anyway, he was very funny. He did a sleaze comedy called, I can't remember the name of it, where it's shot in black and white, and it's a fraternity party, and I never saw the whole thing from beginning to end. It really wasn't my style, but having food fights, Animal House, yeah, that was the movie he started, Belushi. And he starred in the Blues Brothers and Ghostbusters and a couple of other those. And every one of his Saturday Night Live appearances were like record hits. So he became one of the most famous. Him and his pal, who I can't remember his name, and a bunch of others became very, very famous. But then Belushi mysteriously died, apparently of a drug overdose. And it came to light to the entire world that this guy wasn't just minorly addicted to drugs. He was completely out there on drugs, heroin and stuff, staying up all night. And he just burned himself out and died. And the only reason I'm bringing this up, on this program, because that happened decades ago, is that I was channel surfing for something to watch that wasn't totally inane. So as I was surfing through the channels, John Belushi's name came up and Saturday Night Live came up, and I was never a big fan of Saturday Night Live. It always depressed me. But in any case, Belushi's films came up, and all of a sudden, I remembered that among the countless books I read, that about a year after Belushi died, a big, thick, best-selling book about Belushi came out, written by a massive best-selling author, and it chronicled the entire life of Belushi, the drugs, the stardom, et cetera, et cetera. And it was captivating because it was done in a journalistic style, which told you what was really going on, but he had facts and documents to back them up. And I was gripped. Because I couldn't believe that on one hand, this kid comes from nowhere and becomes one of the biggest superstars in the world, but tied together with his incredible talent, he is hardcore addicted on heroin and cocaine and some other stuff at the same time. Most of the time, people don't even know it because they can't tell the difference between his eccentric, stoned personality and his sober personality. They just think it's him being goofy. When in reality, he's just like high all the time, and it swallowed up his life. Because I'm sure he had access in Manhattan and when he was in L.A. to the biggest drug dealers, the ones who cater to the movie stars and the directors and the movers and shakers. He probably had a constant flow, constant access to drugs, and burned his body and mind out, and died tragically at a young age. And the world was horrified, but there was really totally no need for it. So the point is that you have all that energy. A guy comes from nowhere, gets incredible breaks, becomes a superstar, becomes super wealthy, et cetera, super famous, but it destroys him, which is so often the case. It destroys him. I mean, just think of all the stories in Hollywood. It absolutely destroys him. And that industry can destroy people. Normally I wouldn't bring this up, but I'm in the flow of the conversation. My wife and I were attending a fundraiser for a very famous superstar athlete. And you would probably recognize his name and stuff. Okay, so everybody had their tables assigned to them. My wife and I arrived late by accident. We got stuck in traffic. So we arrived about 30 minutes after the thing started, so we had to sit towards the back. And we did. My wife and I just grabbed the table and sat in the back. And, there were famous bands, famous singers, famous athletes, famous movie stars there. And then the next thing you know, this lady and her didn't look like a boyfriend, but let's just call it boyfriend or male friend or whatever. And I can't really see who this lady is because her hair is kind of frizzed out, And my wife gives me a gentle elbow and says, "That's." By this time, I'd figured out who it is, and my wife gently nudges me and says, "That's Farrah for a set." I said, "I know." So, in Hollywood, the thing is, if it's a movie star that sits next to you, depending upon where you're going in LA, you could end up going in a place in LA where that's kind of like not all that unusual anyway. The protocol in the culture is you don't break the ice and go blah, blah, blah. Oh, I'm a big fan of your work. And, that's just like, you just don't acknowledge it. But the funny thing is, if you don't acknowledge it, these movie stars get their feelings hurt. It's really an irony. Anyway, I just, was friendly and nice. Okay. And the thing is, though, I couldn't help notice that the pain in her eyes and the sense of rejection she had experienced from Hollywood. And so on one hand, there's a girl who comes from nowhere. And I guess on the basis of her hairstyle, which was so unique, Farrah Fawcett becomes, what that famous TV series she was in, and then movies she was in, and she becomes this massive star. Massive, massive star. But she's heartbroken. Her husband leaves her. And then tragically, she dies of a disease at a very young age. It's very tragic. So what I'm saying is just because you get all those big external things that people in our society want, like fame, power, money, sex, women, men, wealth, whatever it is you think, is going to make you happy, the Bible teaches us that kind of stuff, can be pleasurable for a season. God's word actually says that sin can be pleasurable for a season. But if you try to make a lifelong journey with sin or a lifestyle of sin, it'll eat you to death. It'll rot you to death from the inside. And so that's his warning. That's his warning. So how does it apply to where we are now? It applies in a huge way to where we are now. So you and I and everybody else all over the world, we wake up to this coronavirus thing, okay? We wake up to a world of social isolation and masks and gloves and ventilators and deaths and all kinds of things. And all these laws, you can't be here, you can't be there. And we wake up into a world that in some respects looks nothing like the world we lived in prior to it, especially in America, where we had a relative degree of freedom. We wake up into this Orwellian thought police world where the corporate news media is babbling on endlessly about the new normal. How could they possibly give us news reporting on the new normal when they never properly comprehended the old normal or normal? So we're going to trust the people who couldn't comprehend normal or the old normal. We're going to trust these same people to give us reporting on what the new normal is? Of course not, because they have no ability to comprehend it. And by the way, the new normal may have architectural diagrams and blueprints, but the new normal is not fixed in stone yet. See, that's like a psyops move. That's a psychological operations move to talk and communicate as if your revolution was already accomplished by referring to the new normal as a done deal, by referring to the new normal as something that will inevitably happen. And this is what the new normal is going to look at. All of that are procedures in psychological warfare or psyops. They're implanting in your subconscious mind a very powerful vision of your enslavement being the new norm and the new normal. It's a mind control game. It's how you bring nations and peoples down. So it's very important that you understand that just because you have powerful and wealthy people in this nation and around the world, people like Bill Gates and the United Nations and World Health Organization and others, and the Rockefellers and all the other people that are into eugenics and population control and vaccinations and drones and mass surveillance and stuff. Just because you have a globalist elite that is, I believe, trying to flagrantly and openly dominate planet Earth and the people of planet Earth, does not mean that their vision for their new world order is legitimate. It's illegitimate. The reason it's illegitimate is it violates the most powerful laws of the universe. The most powerful laws of the universe flow from an understanding that God is love, and everything that God does is an expression of his love. And God would never create a new normal world, which is a nightmare. It's against his character. Only man, only fallen man, would put together a new normal world. We saw that with Adolf Hitler tried to put together a new normal world. Many other dictators tried to put together, communist dictators tried to put together a new normal world. And all of them failed. They were nightmare. George Orwell, 1984, Big Brother horror shows. That's what they were. They weren't normal at all. So don't be fooled by these propaganda words of the new normal as if, God himself came down with the 10 commandments and here each commandment is a new normal. No, this is a bunch of fallen men's ideas on how to subjugate society using mass surveillance, using satellites, using 5G, using electronic tracking equipment and cell phones, like in the CARE program. This is about a small number of super billionaires taking over the world by calling it a new normal. But you don't have to accept that as the new normal. And you have a right as a citizen of planet Earth and a son and daughter of God to stand up and say politely and lovingly that I don't accept your definition of a new normal. And others need to join you. And you say, I don't accept your vision of a new normal. Your vision of a new normal looks more like a global concentration camp. I believe this is how the new normal should function. And then you just actively rise up and legally and in a law-abiding way seize leadership and participation. You can't give your power over to people who are, we hear about the experts. The experts, they were not trained in curing diseases. They were trained in the transmission of diseases. They're biological warfare experts, not biological warfare healing experts. There's a difference. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. Help us get this message out far and wide by sending it yourself to your links in your groups. Link up to our social media, join our social media, and help promote our messages as we are functioning together as one in an effort to portray, shape, create the new normal. And that means we got to take it out of the hands of those that want to create a Frankenstein new normal and create a world worth living in, at least until the Lord returns. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. This is the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. It is of critical importance that we understand this because right now, America, the European Union, Asia, South America, Canada, many other regions in the world, many other nations in the world, are in a sense up for grabs. By that I mean the impact of the coronavirus has shaken them so hard, so severely, that not only are they recovering from the biological impact of the coronavirus, but they're also dealing with the economic employment, job, food, hungriness dimensions of the coronavirus, people's savings and retirement being wiped out, people losing jobs, etc. All of the negative financial stuff. And then along with that will come the negative social stuff, addiction, drugs, divorces, etc., etc. And sadly to say, yes, sadly to say, we have in our society social engineers and radical activists who are financed by, yes, capitalist super billionaires for the purpose of generating a counterfeit socialist revolution in our nation. But secretly, they're financed by the super capitalists. And they want to overthrow the existing order or bring in chaos so they can create their new normal, which is a socialist Cuban-style world, which is a nightmare on earth. So it's critical at this time that God's people understand that preaching salvation, the message of salvation, the message of Christ's forgiveness by faith in his blood, is of the utmost importance in terms of priorities. But God's people in the United States and around the world must also remember that something that is of an equivalent in terms of a priority is bringing to people and these attacked nations the vision, the true vision that God has for them personally with their lives, and the true vision that God personally has for them and their nation. So we can't acquiesce, we can't surrender a biblical worldview, our biblical perception, we can't surrender it to this predominant, powerful, so-called priesthood of oftentimes self-conferred experts in diseases and disease spread transmission models. And all these, quote, so-called experts, and I don't mind experts being called who are experts, but we have a lot of people speaking with enormous authority in our society. And these people who are speaking with enormous authority in our society are gaining their authority by making reference to their medical degrees, their medical training, what institutes, what hospitals they worked with, what political divisions they worked with or headed up. There's this whole bureaucracy of bureaucratic experts in both medicine and other areas who are attempting to be prophetic. They're attempting to be prophetic voices in the recreation and rebuilding of America. Now, think about how angry the press got when the President of the United States, President Donald Trump, dared to defy these priests and overruled them in terms of how fast Trump predicted the economy would recover. And the media went berserk on Trump because how dare he speak? He's not an expert in recovery from viruses. But neither are these people, by the way. They're not even remotely experts on the recovery of a virus. So Trump at least was the first person to enunciate clearly that the victims and the people that were the most vulnerable are people, that includes people who lose their jobs or because of their age or because they're in a rest home or whatever, can contract the disease and die. So only Trump was looking at it from the multidimensional aspect of a businessman, where it was vibrant detail to him of the massive economic costs, the job costs, the employment costs, the money cost that would produce suicides, divorces, bankruptcies. See, these bureaucrats didn't have that on their radar screen because they've made their whole lives living from paycheck to paycheck. They've never had to earn a commission. They've never had to win a contract where either you perform on the job or you get paid nothing. See, bureaucrats and people who, I'm not knocking you, but people who have only worked in hourly employment or as bureaucrats don't understand the enormous pressure of creating something from nothing. So Trump was looking at America through the eyes of an economic rebound, which he already launched. So America, if we stop looking at America through the lens of a overly pessimistic and negative projection of the future based on the coronavirus. The reason I say overly pessimistic is because, let's be honest, many times when you are talking to people, and I'm not saying this to disparage them, but many times when you talk to people that work for bureaucracies, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's education, whether it's city planning or whatever, or even some facets of the military, what you see is people that have learned how to adapt themselves to the power flow charts of a bureaucracy. And they're used to doing things in a incremental long-term timetable. So people who are entrepreneurs, who start businesses, etc., are not as locked into one model of growth or another model of growth. People that are in the business world that are not bureaucrats are locked into the mode which will produce the most growth with the highest percentage rate of safety and return. And so if you're using that model, that type of model is far more Christian and biblical in the way it's constructed than the other model, which is built on pessimistic secular humanism. And so we have to remember that whether they admit it or not, people who are secular humanists ultimately, they can't help themselves. They are ultimately pessimists, and they ultimately have a negative view of life. Because in their perception of life, there's birth, there's life for a lifetime, and there's death. In their minds, there is no alternative to death. So they are inherently pessimistic because of their theological orientation. They have no expectation of a salvation or even the possibility of a salvation from death. And that makes their worldview very negative and warped because everything that they're looking at is based on whether or not mankind has the resources, the money, the energy to build or construct such an alternative reality. Whereas you see somebody who has been in the habit of trusting God, all things are possible with God, nothing is impossible with God, that person has developed a lifetime of trusting God and putting the vision in God's hand and praying to God for help and watching God supernaturally move to help that individual by providing resources, plans, and a vision, etc. So that's where we are in America. Right now, there's two worldviews in mortal combat. On one side, we have the pessimistic humanist worldview, which is dark, it's negative, it's Orwellian, it's Big Brother, it's mass surveillance, it's mass vaccinations, and it's a dark, despairing worldview because it's a reality where God, the personal living God of the universe, has been sucked right out of the picture. On the other hand, standing before us, we have a potential worldview of growth, of love, of light, of possibility, of prosperity, of fruition, of dreams coming true, innovations being generated, and not only that, man surviving, thriving, overcoming, and achieving. That vision can be brought to pass. That highly optimistic vision can be brought to pass to the degree that that highly optimistic vision is integrated with the promises of God's word, which say things like, with God, all things are possible. Nothing is impossible with God. As long as your dream or your vision is integrated into the reality of God and God's ability to perform a miracle or a series of miracles, then anything is essentially possible. And that creates a great foundation of hope in our own personal souls and in the collective souls of us in America and around the world. And so let's embrace that hope, because that hope is the power of the resurrection. The resurrection says that no, death is not the final statement about Jesus Christ and God. The resurrection happens even after Christ dies. And Christ then promises to ascend into heaven, and then he's going to descend from heaven at the second coming and start the new heaven, the new earth, and the new Jerusalem. God bless you. This is Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. Go to paulmcguire.us. Go to the Roku Channel, Paul McGuire Ministries. Watch all the hundreds of hours of Bible prophecy teaching, the conferences. Sign up to our Facebooks, our YouTubes, our Brighteon.coms, and be blessed by and enjoy all the teaching ministry, Bible study that we have for you for free on all these channels, and then send the channels to your friends so they can be blessed by them. Visit paulmcguire.us, and remember, we can do what we're doing, and we're succeeding at what we're doing because many of you have chosen to be intercessory prayer warriors. I thank God for you. You're obedient. You're spreading the word. You're partnering with us. I thank God for you. And you're seeking the Lord and praying for us and joining together with us with your financial contributions and donations. God bless all of you. And let's act as one and see how mighty God is and how mighty God can move. God bless you. This is Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us.